A quick introduction, the Renewable Energy Association, I hope many of you know us. We're the largest renewables trade body in the UK. We cover heat, transport, energy storage, as well as generation, all generation apart from wind. And in fact, we're just launching a new sector group on electric vehicles, which again ties in a lot of the work we do in transport, a lot of work we now do with energy storage, and obviously with solar. There's a nice Venn over line. So that's roughly what I'm going to be talking to today. Sorry, quite a lot of Brexit, but it is now the most important thing probably that the government, well, almost certainly that the government faces, and what trade associations and businesses will be looking at in the next 2 years. Before that, I think this all comes with a backdrop as well. Obviously, the last year since the election, we have seen an awful lot of policy change, an awful lot of flux, a lot of uncertainty for investors, and actually on the bottom line, an awful lot of withdrawal of support. I think this was all on the back of an austerity package, and of course those figures may not now be quite so important, but it's still, I think, relevant to look at, I think, over 15 negative or at least suboptimal policy changes we faced in the last government. But as I said, in the last 4 weeks, the world sort of turned, certainly in Westminster, on its head. And I think the first reaction certainly, well, we had actually very mixed reactions from members. Some genuinely not wondering what this meant. It was a complete surprise to all of our members, and I'm sure to many of you here in the room. And I think instantly it's such a big change that it's quite a difficult thing to try and fathom. And I think actually we're still in this space where we're still trying to gather the scope and the enormity of what could happen. There's also an argument that a lot of people need to start thinking about the simplicity of what's just happened as well. And I think that's the second thing and the opportunity that we need to be looking at. But first off, we need to know what the actual nuts and bolts of it are. So, in essence, we've all heard of Article 50. Article 50 is once you have triggered it, and again, there are legal arguments about who can trigger it and when we can trigger it, and I think that's a huge decision, actually, when the government takes it. Most of our power at the moment comes from the fact that we are the one at least in charge of triggering Article 50. Once we will have a 2-year timetable. If we cannot get an agreement within that 2 years, then we end with nothing. The actual Article 50 itself, it is not a trade deal, and it should be pointed out in Europe, making it very clear that the process of Article 50, the process of separation, which is all that Article 50 is, it will not lead to a trade deal. It is not a trade deal. In fact, there are many in Europe who are saying they will not even contemplate, even start discussing a trade deal until we are a third party, until Article 50, the process has been finalised. And the next thing to think about Article 50 and the deal and the separation and the terms of separation is that it has to be agreed by the other 27 states, and that's done on a qualified majority basis, which means that you need 20 member states that represent 65% of the EU population. That's quite a high barrier, which means that it is unlikely that this will be a fantastic deal, as you have to please so many other governments, and it should be mentioned that France and Germany have both got national elections next year, and the context for that, obviously with domestic politics, certainly in France, is one that this is a very tricky political time to be negotiating with. At home, once we have this, and sort of in crude terms, the divorce settlement, we then need to start looking at what legislatively and regulatory that means for us. All of the EU legislation, everything that we have from the EU, is all underpinned from the European Communities Act 1972. That act enshrines the supremacy of EU law. There is disagreement over whether it is necessary to repeal this act in its entirety to officially leave the EU. There are some that think you can keep the act and change some terms in it, and that would actually make the whole transposition over, or the transition over, of laws easier. There are some that think that you just have to get rid of it and start again. And getting rid of it means ripping out 40 years worth of all our laws, and it's quite a tricky thing to know what's an EU law and where's that come from. It's not tricky if you look at a particular act, but if you look at 40 years worth of governing and 40 years worth of parliament, that is a huge change. We have, at the REA, already started to look at what legislation impacts on businesses, and certainly businesses day to day. And this is a very high line, sort of top level look at where the competences and shared competences lie. Most of the environmental, and for that also most of the target-based legislation, is used in 192 of Article 192. We're beginning to think in the office as 192 and 194, and I'm sure by the end of this presentation you too will be thinking in just terms of Article 192 and 194. 192 is the environment balance of competences, and member states have less control over this than Article 194, where a lot of the competences are shared both in UK and EU law. That means that by the end, if we cannot reach agreement on this and there is no clear plan, those competences fall away from the UK. I would also, just as I point out, there are certain lawyers in the front row here who I'm sure at the end of this will give a much better and much more complete and bespoke vision of your company's effects on this, but I'm sure he will say that later. Under 194, that's a lot of the day-to-day energy regulation, and that it looks like a lot more of that is underpinned in UK law. EU treaties and most regulations are directly implemented into UK law. They are gold-plated. In through the Act of 1972. Secondary legislation, directives and decisions are implemented in UK law via primary and secondary legislation. These could be repealed if the 1972 Act is removed in full. I'm looking around, and does that make sense? Because it took me quite a long time to try and understand and trying to get around that certain things will fall away after 2 years and certain things won't. And that's important to know when we go on to what the industry should be campaigning for later. A lot of these discussions, obviously, around what the policy risks of Brexit have been. The likelihood of nuclear in Hinkley Point C, I've got to be honest, straight off the bat, I thought the likelihood of Hinkley has now gone from a 0.001% chance of happening to a 0.00001% chance of happening. There are differences in opinion on that too. I think that the chances of a French government now with Ségolène Royal as energy minister and her ex-husband as president. The chances of Ségolène Royal wanting to give money and risk bankrupting EDF to a country that is no longer in the EU, I think is unlikely. Her ex-husband, on the other hand, wants to show that this is a vision to the world that France can still compete. And as far as trade, this is very important to his vision of what EDF should be doing. I still think that the increased costs of capital, the increased risks, added to all the existing risks, I think has made it unlikely. Now that's important because that suddenly makes the carbon budget 4 look, well actually, sorry, it wasn't ever going to actually affect carbon budget 4, as it turns out with the timetable it was supposed to. It makes carbon budget 5 now look nigh on impossible with where the government direction is at the moment, as well as leaves a huge gap in low carbon generation that there was political consensus over. That is a huge opportunity for renewables. On the capacity mechanism, it has been a huge frustration to, I'm sure, everybody in this room, unless you have diesel, which don't shout if you do, you'll get lynched later. But the capacity mechanism obviously has not been very good for the renewables industry, and there are certain constraints over state aid. Most of the positives you'll see coming out of Brexit, certainly in the energy sphere, come around the newfound freedom that we'll have away from state aid. It will also give us an opportunity to close that loophole on Dieselgate. So there is an opportunity to reform the capacity mechanism outside of the EU. Future of CFD pots, as I said earlier on, most of the difficulties we've seen this year have been through budgetary constraints. They've been through the fact that there is no more money left in the levy control framework. So everything that we've seen has been stemming from that. The fact that Pot 1 technologies, which is where solar sits, does not look like it is going to get funding between now and 2020, is down to that spending constraint. Now, a new government coming in, a new government wanting to boost the economy, may well have a new vision on that, and of course a new department with industrial strategy, and may feel that now is exactly the time that we need to start putting things that are shovel-ready and that provide jobs and also have an inherent benefit to the energy, to the infrastructure and to our energy problems. So it could be that we see a relaxation of the levy control framework. It could be that we see more fluid rules and more beneficial rules when it comes to CFD pots. At the moment, they are heavily controlled by state aid rules. The 2025 coal pledge, this is more on the negative side of it. How strong is that now? If nuclear does go down, if we are now in the new 15 to 20 years of conservative hegemony in the government, or indeed whatever comes out of this, it could be that the right-wing forces, in whatever phase they are, and after a successful Brexit, could be thinking that actually the 2025 coal pledge was a mistake, that we need to go back to that country that was built on coal, and we need that certainty, and we need that cheap electricity. It is something that, with a resurgence of that wing of political thought, could come back. But it is hugely welcoming that actually the government, only 3 days after the votes, did commit us to the Climate Change Act, and that does give us a certain amount of protection. The second thing about, the other targets-based point here is the 2020 and 2030. I think we can probably forget about 2030. In fact, many of us, I'm sure, in the industry had already forgotten about 2030 EU targets. They were not particularly enforceable, nor were they particularly beneficial, nor did they differ particularly from the Climate Change Act, which we have in the UK. But 2020 targets are hugely important to heat and transport still, where we're failing, as well as still potentially to energy generation, electricity generation, which may have to actually overachieve to make up for the lack of progress we see in heat and transport. As I'm sure you're all aware, we have a 15% target. Of that, 30% is based on, or just over 30% is based on electricity generation, 12% on heat, and 10% on transport. At the moment, we are falling down on transport. We're around 3% on transport, down from 4.5 last year. We are also roughly around 4.5, maybe up to 4.8% on our heat target, and that needs to get up to 12%. So you can see that we are falling down on our 2020 targets, and actually electricity may need to overcompensate for those sectors. But the point is, they're EU targets. Now, I don't know how long Article 50 is going to take, but certainly that investor confidence that 2020 targets gave are now under a certain amount of risk. And that's one of the questions we'll be asking. At the moment, the government is still saying they are committed to 2020 targets until they are told otherwise, which, again, doesn't particularly help investor confidence. So Brexit, next steps for your businesses, and I should say by your businesses also the REA. I would suggest there is a need for a regulatory audit of the impact of EU law on your business, not just in the spheres of environment targets and energy, the energy regulation that is around, but also other areas of your business as well. I would say that the REA have begun that work. We will continue that work, but it is not going to be all-encompassing, and obviously we cannot give legal advice. You should also be lobbying government. We are undertaking a huge renegotiation, a huge piece of work that is going to be done by the EU Department for Leaving the EU, or the Brexit Department. You have also now got a new department in BES, or BES, or De Beers. We still haven't heard what that's going to be called either. I would also say that the Brexit Department have already made it be sent, and this is wonderful news for trade bodies. The Brexit Department have already said they are not interested in unilateral conversations with businesses. There are too many issues, there are too many businesses. They will be wanting to speak to trade bodies. So my little plug, and it is the only one, it is an excellent time to join perhaps the largest trade body in the UK. But we will be working very hard in the next 2 years, 3 years with the Brexit Department. There are a number of issues, vast amount of issues, and we'll be trying to both educate them. At the moment, they are desperate for information, as well as trying to steer where the direction of these negotiations are going, and obviously some of the domestic implications that has too. To do that, we are looking at what our ask should be. And in about 3 weeks' time, we'll be having town halls with our members, trying to finalise these and really trying to hear back from our members on what is best for them. My starter for 10 at the moment is that obviously we need business clarity. For that, I would want the negotiations to be looking at transposing all the existing laws, all the existing rules over, all of those directives, all of the EU laws, all of the regulations, we transpose over. And at year dot, we look at, well, now we can change it. I think the idea of trying to have not only these negotiations, but everybody having a cluster lobby at the same time, trying to pick out the things they do and don't like over a very short period of time without any consultation or lack of consultation, without the resource, would be madness. So my strong feeling, and I hope our members will feel that too, is that we, along with other industries, should be asking for everything that you currently have will be transposed over. And there's nothing that stops us from doing that, barring certain issues, certain very niche areas where there are shared competencies. But for the vast majority of business needs, transposing all over those environmental regulations, business regulations, working time law, and transposing the whole thing over, and then let's pick them apart from year dot in a rational way. We need policy certainty. No rowing back from existing government commitments. The worst thing that a new independent Britain needs is that the international community think that you can't trust the government. And to underpin that, any rowing back from, let's say, 2020 targets would be seen as investors in other areas as something that would destabilise and add an extra risk. So no rowing back of the policy certainty and policy objectives that we have so far. I think now is a wonderful opportunity with a new department for a low-carbon infrastructure strategy, and a genuine one that actually looks to drive investment, jobs and trade and tries to fix some of the energy trilemma. I think the energy industry is in a phenomenal place because of those quick build times, because actually, if I'm looking at it, and I hope I hear some about this today, I now think solar is cheaper than gas. If Trafford's saying £72 a megawatt hour, I'm pretty sure that most of the people in this room, most people in the industry can beat that if they're given a solid PPA, if they're given a solid policy direction, and if they're given a steer from government. And the internal energy market, and this may or may mean nothing to you, but one of the many options that we have, whether the Swiss option, Canadian option, Norway option, whether we're part of EFTA, whether we're part of whatever, is do we want to be part of the internal energy market? If, let's say, we are out of everything, which currently seems to be the current government direction, that we are going to be completely out of Europe and we're going to have a trade deal with Europe, no more internal market, but access to certain parts of it. Another decision on top of that will be, do we want to be part of the internal energy market? There is a theory where we could be completely out of everything else, but we opt into the internal energy market. There are going to be many people, I think, from the energy industry that are wanting that. They want that confidence and the safety of being in the internal energy market. And certainly if you're from one of the big six, I'm sure that the direction from your parent board will be to stay in the internal energy market. For me and my members, we need to have a serious look about whether it is in the interests of the UK energy market to be inside. You look at, then we would be bound by state aid, we would have an increased reliance on interconnectors. It embeds the gas strategy for the next 30 to 40 years' time, as well as embedding gas markets, and also pulls renewables out of certain countries into others. That is certainly the winter package in the EU is goal. So one of the questions we'll be putting to members and putting to the wider industry is that, do we actually want to be part of the internal energy market? How long have I got?
Couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes, in which case I can leave you with a quick summary of your new masters. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, on this area, very little we know about what she said in the energy markets, and very little have we heard about the climate change. We were reassured by the Secretary of State last week that she supported Theresa May because she backed the climate change Act. Very little we know, apart from a 2006 blog, which she wrote on her own blog, about how she supports micro wind and solar and doesn't like subsidies to nuclear. I don't know how much store you can put in a blog that's 10 years old, but it got people in my industry a little bit excited. Chancellor of the Exchequer, very solid on the right wing of the party, but very strong on Paris last year. Did an awful lot of work going about putting some of the prep work to the Paris climate change agreement. He also made some excellent speeches trying to redefine the Conservative argument on climate change and environment, had some very nasty words about left-wing NGOs, and tried to invoke the spirit of Reagan and Thatcher in protecting and the pragmatic decision about protecting the world and the environment. Tried to redefine those arguments a bit, and we should bear that in mind when we engage with them. Secretary of State David Davis, complete climate change skeptic, missed the Climate Change Act. I remember having an argument with him on BBC Radio Lincolnshire North about wind farms about 7 years ago. I don't think I convinced him. We have the BAS Secretary, Greg Clark. You'll see here giving a speech to the REA. We haven't changed our logo in that long. That's incredible. He was the former Shadow Secretary of State at DEC. He was, in many ways, he completely changed the culture of how they thought about climate change and green issues in the Conservative Party. He was very much part of that a husky brigade, and wrote two very influential and groundbreaking reports in opposition, and led a whole new wave of green conservatism. Unfortunately, as last year in DCLG, there would be less support, and if you're one of the, I think, 100 megawatts of solar that I suppose, vetoed by him, you won't be feeling quite so warm towards him. Nick Hurd, son of Douglas, he is another huge Green Tory. He sits on the Conservative Environment Group. He put a private members bill in 2006 or 7 on the sustainable communities. Has done a lot of work in the Department for International Development on solar in Africa, so understands the technology very well, and is a former chair on the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the Environment. And quickly, Margot James, very little knowledge about her. Sorry, I can quickly take that photo if you want. But you do get them all. Has a history of saying reasonably warm things about climate change, but usually backs up the energy-intensive users. So next steps for the industry. We need to have more Brexit unit. You need to start having discussions with the Brexit unit through your trade body. There will be a discussion around the Article 50 and when it's triggered. That's our only trump card we have in these negotiations. We have new ministers, and they are at pains to say it is business as usual. There will still be, I think at the moment we've had 38 consultations that we've responded to this year. I'm sure they will not slow down at all. We will still have a new government, and with new ministers thinking that they can save their particular department. We have, obviously, business rates. We had a meeting with the Secretary of State last week on business rates. She is no longer the Secretary of State. It's a very frustrating thing as a lobbyist, where you work so hard to get a meeting and then they go and get another job. But we did raise it with her officials, and it was a surprise to them. It was something that took them aback. I am sure that the work of BES and the work of DEC will still continue within BES, and we are following up with that. It is something that I think DEC will treat very seriously, and we are working hard on that. We're wanting to make sure that we maybe be able to have a second another CFD auction for solar. We're working on enhanced capital allowances. I think that is something that there is still scope for us to push forward. If we are not going to get a new subsidy, there is a chance to get a more supportive tax regime. And we have a flexibility call for evidence. That means nothing to anybody unless you know that is where DEC are looking, or BES are looking to put in the new changes to energy storage. It's a huge call for evidence. We've been working on it with them for the last 6 months. We're expecting it any day now. It is a very key consultation if you care about energy storage. We also have party conferences, and they're going to be fantastic this year, and God knows which leaders we're going to get by then. And just because what everybody loves for investor confidence, we could still yet have a general election in October or November this year. I think it will be very difficult for Theresa May, sitting on a 10 to 12 point poll lead, to think, you know what, I'm quite happy with my 12 majority. We could finish the year with a general election and yet more ministers, and I will happily come back next year and give you another update on where we are in politics. Excellent, thank you.
Thank you, James.